Hi guys, I guess the first thing I wanted to quickly say is thank you for tuning in to these videos, and I've gotten some great feedback. Please forgive me if you're seeing the same imagery used along with the audio. The bottom line is I am recycling some images just because I think it's better than staring at a blank screen. Lately, the images I've been using are from my own films, so it feels really great to share them because without the dialogue or really the soundtrack, they take on a whole new abstract sort of non-linear feel, and I love it. And strangely, the imagery, through some kind of alchemy, seems to complement the words that are coming out of my mouth. When I go back and watch it, it's just like this whole new level to the material when I look at the juxtaposition of the word and the image. It doesn't always happen, but here and there it's pretty astounding. So anyway, enjoy, and please don't get sick of these particular images. I'm recycling them. I'll dig deeper for the next video and find some old footage to use. All right, so I wanted to talk today a little bit about the cathartic function of art on a very unexamined level of the creative process, that is, but also about sort of the subtext of thematic content that also often goes unexamined. Basically, I've spoken quite a bit about the cathartic function of the creative process, and I guess I would venture to say of art and literature for sure, in that the creator often experiences catharsis. I've said before that, in speaking to my actors on a given film, for example, they're very much either expressly or intuitively choose their parts based on sort of a demon they need to work through or an issue they need to work through. And they often come out the other end having transformed in some way. And we all agree that you may not have engaged fully in the creative process if you don't transform as a result of it. So I don't want to take too much time here, but one of the segments I did on this topic, just spoke about how, of course, it's cathartic to express oneself, and especially if the pain is raw, for example. Not that all inspiration comes from pain, but in that scenario where one's heart is broken, for example, and I use Bonnie Raitt as an example, and she immediately, just writes a song about it, and then in a sort of disconnected way sometimes, the circuit is completed 2,000 miles away when somebody who's had a similar experience hears the song on the radio and experiences their catharsis. So I speak a lot about how, yes, art or the creative process is cathartic for the creative or the artist, but then by extension, it provides catharsis for the patron. And then one hopes, by extension on the macro scale, society evolves as a byproduct. So that said, I know that whenever I examine the themes in literature, for example, or better put, I never quite agree with what critics have to say. It seems pretty far removed from the way storytellers and artists think, in my view. But when I examine what I experience as the main themes and sub-themes of a piece, I'm very aware that there's, of course, the superficial plot, right? The surface level, ostensible plot. But then there's the metaphorical meaning, which is usually something to do with the human condition that's relatable, of course, and universal. But for me, again, being who I am, I often then see an even more base level truth being spoken about literally the metaphysical level of life, about the expression of consciousness in the physical realm. That sounds really heady, but it is a little bit different than the human condition you hear spoken about in academic circles. For me, I often see something really profound in every story to do with this, literally the nature of life in the physical realm. And I won't say too much. And of course, that's not the level on which certainly theater might land, because it can be sort of heady and philosophical and cerebral. But in a feeling medium like film, those themes are not going to transcend. So I'm pretty good at, speaking to my audience and not being too heady or cerebral in a feeling medium like film. So I can reel it in, but I am the weirdo who does see sublevels and sublevels. And that's the beauty of art and literature. It's open to the projection of the patron. And I guess I wanted to say, but beyond all of that, I've always had this view, but it came to mind today for some reason, that there is another level on which the catharsis operates. So when I write a piece, for example, I know what my intended themes are. Of course, I know, not that it's didactic or preachy in any way, but I know what themes I want to explore, whether it's the flip sides of an issue or the good, the bad, and the ugly of an issue, or actually a message. Not a didactic moral, hopefully, but perhaps it could be qualified as a message, or a moral even, though I tend to avoid that like the plague. But inevitably, when I read my own work later, again, the beauty of putting pen to paper or opening one's mouth to tell a story orally, we're sort of just wired for storytelling. Perhaps due to the tropes one has been exposed to, the moment one opens one's mouth to tell a story or puts pen to paper, inevitably there will be a conflict. And inevitably that will resolve in some way. It could be a tragedy where neither the want nor the need is met, or it could be the opposite, which is actually called a comedy, but it just means there is redemption, where either the want or the need, it just comes out that way. I once read an article from a screenwriter who was, I think, being a little bit facetious and playing it lowbrow, and a little bit of false humility, saying, I don't care about the meaning behind anything I write. I don't really think about subtext or metaphorical meaning or about messaging or anything like that. I just worry about the bank heist. But if he was being earnest and not facetious, the joke's on him, because, you know, it's just well known that the patron will project meaning onto any, right, creative content. So, and again, I'm just fascinated by storytelling because we're wired for it, and it's just going to come out that way whether we intend it to be one-dimensional or not. So anyway, all that said, I've often looked back, and I'll give you some clear-cut examples, but I've looked back at my own writing and just been fascinated, not that God spoke through me or that I have any special talent whatsoever, but it's the nature of the act of storytelling that fascinates me. I find sublevels in my own writing that I was not aware of consciously. So one example I'll use is literally the first thing I ever wrote of any significance or length that I actually finished was a novella, I guess you'd call it, a sci-fi novella. I was in high school, and thank God for my best friend down the street's mother, because she allowed me to use her manual typewriter at the time. I guess it was an electric typewriter, but it certainly was not a word processor. They didn't really exist yet, or home computers didn't anyway. Very few people had them. But she let me sit at that typewriter literally every day for weeks and months and finish this thing. And anyway, ostensibly it was probably influenced by Bradbury, because I read a lot of Bradbury, but it was about, you know, a kid on in a biodome on a spacecraft headed for our new home, because we, as is now happening, kind of destroyed our own habitat. So it took several generations to get to Alpha Centauri, but this kid's whole existence is spent as if he's being chewed up and spit out by the dialectic, and he's just serving a function, you know, kind of like an ant in an ant farm, and he's looking for the meaning because he's just kind of right stuck in the middle generation-wise, and he's never going to see their new destination. His whole life will be spent on this craft in this biodome. So anyway, I knew what I thought I was writing. And then there was a girl named Beth that appeared deep in the fabricated forest in the biodome that he dreams about, and she even breaks free in one of the dreams and is freed. And anyway, I thought I was writing about one thing, but all years later I thought, oh my God, it's so glaring. That was me trying to be out, like trying to out myself. And it had something to do with, I guess, the female aspects of my personality, but certainly the gay factor. Another example I can cite is this. When I was going to New York Film Academy, I was just completely overwhelmed. It's a very intense program. It's very condensed. You hardly have time to think, let alone come up with solutions for assignments, right? It's just like Art Center. I've seen all of my students experience, and my colleagues, my classmates when I was in school. Your brain is just so full that you cannot germinate and come up with a concept that's inspired, except in the wee hours of the morning or literally in a dream. because all the germination is happening when your mind is at rest, and there's just no time to consciously come up with a concept, and the magic, perfect solution always comes in that state where I guess gamma waves are flowing. So that happened during New York Film Academy. I was germinating. I had to come up with a solution for this assignment by the next day and then start shooting by the day after that. And my brain was just so full. And I had a house guest that was also attending New York Film Academy with me, and I was playing concierge and host. And so I went downstairs just to get away from him, frankly, and he brought my sketchbook and just tried to come up with my concept. I was just beginning to formulate this idea of, for some reason, at that moment in my 30s, early 30s, these boundaries that we create to sort of protect ourselves from the pain of others. So I think of it like backing away from an abyss. We have this unexamined fear of just opening up our compassion as if we'll be dragged into some abyss with the other party, when really that's not the truth at all. But I don't know what, so I was just toying around with this idea, what are we actually afraid of when there's low-hanging fruit and somebody just seems desperate and we back away? And what is the real fear, and what's the worst thing that could happen if we open our hearts and view others through the eyes of compassion or love? Just beginning to formulate that, and literally around the corner comes a homeless woman that I had seen in the neighborhood. I came to know her as Sister St. Clair later, but this was one of my first interactions with her. She comes around the corner, literally pushing a shopping cart, stops right in front of me and my sketchbook and says, "Would you give me a back rub? I need it so bad." She literally just was very raw about it. And I came up with an entire concept. And it was basically a short film, which I ended up making in its entirety, about a guy who's in a big hurry. He's just finished his architectural renderings. He's got to deliver them, so he jumps in his little convertible BMW, and he's tooling around town trying to get there. But of course, the universe is trying to slow him down. He ends up in a traffic jam. The name of the film is Detour. But before he ends up in the traffic jam, there's little, I don't know, I want to say bones being thrown in his path by the universe, telling him to slow down and get involved. Do not be egocentric. Extend yourself communally somehow. And so one is, he first sees a dog dragging a leash, so it's clearly lost its owner, or its human, I should say. And he could obviously stop and try to help find the owner or deliver it to the nearest shelter or an adoption agency or a rescue organization, but he's in a hurry, so he keeps going. Then I think the next thing he encounters is a man pushing his car. He's broken down, and he could stop and help the man push it to safety, but of course he's in a hurry, so they exchange haunting gazes, and he keeps going. So the stakes keep getting higher and higher, and the universe screams louder and louder to get his attention, to the point where when he's stuck in that traffic jam on a rather narrow street in downtown Los Angeles, he happens to look up and see a very desperate woman who's ready to jump from a fire escape. He can't go anywhere because of the traffic jam, so she literally lands on his windshield. That couldn't be a louder knock at the door by the universe, right? So anyway, I was aware that the film, at the time, that the film had a lot to do with just these imaginary boundaries we create to protect ourselves from what? I was just asking the questions. I don't know that I had any answers. But again, years later, I look back and I'm like, it couldn't be clearer that I was trying to lend myself a hand and teach myself to be more compassionate and to open my heart and not always be in such a hurry. I didn't beat myself up over it, but I was in my 30s. I had a mortgage. I wasn't managing it all, so I think my compassion was the casualty, and I was trying to give myself the opportunity to learn and grow and transform. That's the glaring level on which it speaks to me now. But of course, I didn't see that I didn't see it in myself so much, and I didn't see that was the main thrust of the film. The reason I didn't really beat myself up too much about my closed heart or my lack of compassion is that even then, I think I had the understanding that in youth, you just don't really know who you are yet, and it takes a while, right? But you're also used to keeping your distance because when you're young, people want something from you. When you're physically beautiful, people are just trying to get in your pants all the time. So I think it's normal to be a little bit suspect. And beyond that, in my own scenario, basically, I never felt safe, literally, with the dysfunction and alcoholism in my home. I don't know that I ever felt safe. That's still my main fantasy, is to feel secure and safe in life. And so I was constantly, putting up boundaries that made me feel like I could control the chaos, the swirling chaos. So anyway, I've definitely come a long way, but at that time, I think that's perhaps why my compassion was a little low. Considering the dysfunction, my mom would talk to anyone, anytime, anywhere. And the more downtrodden, the better, or the more down and out, the better. To paint a picture, my family, in a good way, were so accepting and hospitable and non-judgmental, to their credit. But it was also an era where, there just was no category for protecting your children at all. And so one Thanksgiving, the Hells Angels came in off the highway and dined with us. There was a hotel that my grandparents owned along a pretty popular biking route in the Sierras. And yep, Hells Angels. So that kind of says it all. You add a little bit of dysfunction with the state of the art of parenting in the 70s, and you have very little protection from chaos. And so I just kind of tried to build that for myself. And so the undoing of all those walls and boundaries, which is the equivalent of the opening of my heart and the discovery of my compassion, was a work in progress. So I love that example. I also want to say, Madeleine L'Engle has said, yes, the stories take on a life of their own, and sometimes the character just has to die and you didn't see it coming, but you've got to obey it. And of course, I write that way too, where I'll inevitably get to a point, even though I've done my structure, I've done my 3x5 cards, I've moved plot points around and set things up and sort of put all the turning points in there so things land emotionally. But inevitably there comes a point where I'm like, I actually don't know the ending, and it feels like a lot of responsibility, as if I'm writing answers for my own life. So that's the beauty. You do sometimes put demons to rest, or reconcile something, or atone for something, or simply just grow and transform as a result of the creative process. That's why I'm addicted to it. It's not a diary. It's not just expressing oneself. It's not just being heard, because God knows nobody reads my stuff. It's not just creating a legacy or trying to leave a mark because of existential terror. It's sort of using storytelling to provide those opportunities to face your fears and conquer them. That's one silly way of putting it. All right, well, thanks for listening, and tune in for the next, not always pearl of wisdom, but grist for the mill, food for thought. Okay, take care, guys. Bye.